Hello, everybody, and welcome back. This is your host, B9400 Ben Discusses History. First of all, I would like to apologize for the long hiatus. I know you've all probably heard that before. This little thing called life got in the way. First and secondly, I'd like to all wish you a very good afternoon from my current location, which is the United Kingdom. The weather here is absolutely glorious so far. But anyway, today we're going to be discussing the life and career of the fifth president of the United States, that being James Monroe of the Democratic Republican Party, as it was known then. Anyway, James Monroe was born on the 28th of April, 1758, and he was the fifth president of the U.S. from the Democratic Republican Party, and the last president who belonged to the generation of America's founding fathers. His career spanned more than half a century, taking him from a teenage soldier in the Revolutionary War against Great Britain and its empire to statesman, diplomat, governor, cabinet secretary, and finally president. He is remembered above all for the Monroe Doctrine, a cornerstone of American foreign policy that helped shape relations between the United States and Europe for generations. He was born on the 28th of April, 1758, at a location known as Monroe Hall in the state of the Commonwealth of Virginia. His family owned a modest tobacco plantation rather than one of Virginia's great estates. Monroe grew up in a rural society dominated by agriculture and deeply influenced by British traditions, who, at the time, was an empire spanning half of this planet and was in control of what was then known as the American colonies. Whilst a child, President Monroe learned to read, write, along with arithmetic, that's mathematics, classical history, and practical farming, since his family literally lived on a tobacco plantation. And unlike several earlier presidents before him, he was not born into exceptional wealth by any means. His upbringing emphasized discipline, hard work, and public service. And by 1774, a good 2 years before the formation of the United States of America as we know it now to be, Monroe entered the College of William and Mary, and it was there he studied subjects ranging from Latin, Greek, mathematics, law, and philosophy. Unfortunately for him, his education was abruptly interrupted by the Revolution and the subsequent events that followed in Boston Harbor in Boston, Massachusetts, Suffolk County, when colonialists who expressed a desire to break away from the British Empire and form their own independent nation tossed British tea into Boston Harbor in defiance of the colonial occupying forces, and this subsequently led to a chain of events that ultimately led to the war breaking out and mass sacrifices on both sides of the divide, and eventually the United States of America was born. Anyway, by 1775, decided to ditch college and sign up with the Continental Army, as led by General George Washington, as he was known then. And he was a teenager at the time, and he actually decided to enroll in the military, or enlist in the military rather, because of the events at the battles of Lexington and Concord, Massachusetts. And during his military service, President Monroe served under the first president of the United States, General George Washington, William Alexander, and Lord Stirling, and he subsequently rose to the ranks of both lieutenant and captain. And on the following year, on the 26th of December, 1776, the year the U.S. officially declared independence from the Imperial British Empire, President Monroe crossed the Delaware River with General Washington, and during this battle, he led an assault upon the British Redcoat forces, and unfortunately for him, he was seriously wounded in the shoulder, and as a result of, this wound, he almost died as a result of catastrophic blood loss, but thankfully he didn't. He lived to tell the tale, and his bravery earned him a promotion to the rank of captain subsequently. Whilst still enrolled in the military and prior to embarking on a life of politics, Monroe endured various, hardships that ranged from hunger, cold, disease, and a lack of supplies. And these experiences basically strengthened his lifelong sense of patriotism towards his nation of birth. And once the conflict had concluded and the British Imperial Redcoat forces, had surrendered, the United States was born. And after all of that had wrapped up, he eventually arrived at the decision that he was going to embark on a career in politics within as it was known then, the Democratic Republican Party. And after the war, Monroe undertook a course on law under the direction of a certain individual by the name of Thomas Jefferson, who just happened to be the third president of the United States once upon a time before him. And during his studies and mentorship under Jefferson eventually became a political mentor and a personal friend, and subsequently a lifelong, influence upon his life right up until the day he died. And eventually, as a result of his close personal relationship with Thomas Jefferson, he made the decision to enter into state politics in the Commonwealth of Virginia, starting in the early 1780s. And now his political career is well and truly underway. Monroe ended up serving in the Commonwealth of Virginia's House of Delegates, the Continental Congress, and then eventually at the federal level in the United States Senate in Washington, D.C. And Monroe's core views, political philosophy, whatever, were centered on specific philosophies such as states' rights, limited federal government, and agricultural interests. And by today's standard and definition, those are traditional, Republican and conservative talking points. In 1786, President Monroe married a lady by the name of Elizabeth Courtwright Monroe, and they had two children together, and they were two daughters, and they were named Eliza Monroe Hay, Maria Hester Monroe Gouverneur. And if I have in any way pronounced that incorrectly, please don't hesitate to let me know down below in the comments section what the correct pronunciation is of that. And Elizabeth subsequently became one of America's earliest first ladies and introduced a more formal style to White House entertaining. Fast forwarding, rather, former President Washington, where during those 4 terms he primarily focused on militia reform, state finances, balancing the budget, stuff like that, basically, public administration, and that wasn't by any means the end of his political service by any means. Once that his 4th term as governor of the Commonwealth of Virginia was up, because he eventually went on to become a diplomat under the former 3rd president of the U.S., Thomas Jefferson, who once again called upon him to undergo a life of diplomatic service. We are now in 1803, and President Monroe joined a gentleman by the name of Robert R. Livingston in the Republic of France. And this was all regarding what would eventually become known as the Louisiana Purchase. And these negotiations unexpectedly resulted in the Louisiana Purchase itself, and on top of that, the rather young United States at the time doubled in size and gained control of the Mississippi River and secured the New Orleans, the Big Easy, Louisiana. This eventually became one of America's greatest diplomatic achievements. And by now we are in 1811, the presidency of James Madison, and the fourth president of the U.S. And he made the decision to appoint Monroe Secretary of State into his administration and cabinet in the year 1811, and then the following year in 1812, Monroe, then Secretary of State, he ended up playing a major role in the War of 1812 because the British imperial forces ended up actually burning the District of Columbia in 1814, and he was currently serving in two official capacities, and they were the Secretary of State and the Secretary of War. And Monroe was basically charged with the responsibility of, reorganizing, the Department of the Army, recruitment, and military, administration. Those were his key responsibilities while undertaking those rather, difficult roles, if you want to put it that way. Now, we're in the year 1816, and Monroe defeated a man by the name of Rufus King and he was officially sworn in as the fifth president of the United States on the 4th of March, 1817, and his presidency lasted from 1817, his year of election, until 1825, when his term ended. And this was referred to as the era of good feelings, as per official documentation and records, whatever. But these reasons included collapse of the Federalist Party, national optimism, economic growth, and westward expansion, such as the California gold rush, to give you one example. Although political disagreements still existed, partisan conflict temporarily declined across both sides of the aisle. President Monroe became the first president in American history to make extensive tours across the country. He visited regions ranging from New England in the Northeast, the southern states, and the western frontier. These trips resulted in strengthened national unity. However, moving on to 1819, the nation unfortunately suffered something that became to be known as the Panic of 1819, and it was, long story short, it was an economic crisis, and the consequences of this crisis included bank failures, mass unemployment, farm foreclosures. Although President Monroe was personally well respected, the crisis damaged public confidence in the economy. We are now in the year 1820, and one of President Monroe's greatest domestic challenges involved the enslavement of fellow human beings. In other words, slavery. And this moment in the history of our nation was known as the Missouri Compromise. The Missouri Compromise admitted that the Show Me state of Missouri in the Midwest as a slave state, and Maine in the Northeast, New England, as a free state. It also prohibited slavery north of latitude 3630 in the remaining Louisiana Purchase territory, except Missouri. The compromise temporarily preserved the balance between free and slave states, postponed rather than restored the sectional conflict that eventually culminated in the American Civil War that started in 1861 and concluded in 1865. And the events that led to the eruption of this conflict was the Confederate Rebellion rising up in defiance of the federal government in Charleston Harbor, South Carolina, in April of 1861 by launching an attack on the federal installation of Fort Sumter, located in Charleston Harbor, South Carolina, and which led to the fort's surrender. And then you fast forward by 4 years later, the 16th president, Abraham Lincoln, a Republican, was assassinated by a Confederate sympathizer and acclaimed stage actor at the time known as John Wilkes Booth at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. And moving on, with a focus on the Deep South now, to the Sunshine State of Florida, Florida eventually becomes an American territory through something that became known as the Adams-Onis Treaty. And the Imperial Empire Kingdom, whatever you want to call it, of Spain at the time, ceded that what was then known, as Florida to the United States. The treaty also settled the western boundary of the Louisiana Purchase, and Secretary of State at the time, John Quincy Adams, negotiated this agreement successfully. We are now in 1823, and Monroe's most enduring achievement during his political career was the Monroe Doctrine. Its principal ideas consisted of the following: European nations should not establish new colonies in the Americas. European intervention in independent American nations would be viewed as a hostile act towards the United States. In return, the United States would generally avoid involvement in European conflicts. Although American military power was limited in 1823, the policy became one of the defining principles of U.S. foreign policy. In 1820, President Monroe faced virtually no organized opposition from the other side of the aisle, yet alone his own party in the primaries. So he was up for re-election, in other words. So anyway, Monroe ended up winning 231 of 232 electoral votes, and only one elector voted for someone else, reportedly to preserve George Washington as the only unanimously elected president. After leaving office, Monroe experienced financial hardship despite decades of public service. He eventually went to live with his daughter in New York. And unfortunately, on the 4th of July, our nation's Independence Day, he passed away in 1831. Remarkably, speaking of the passing of presidents who achieved, legendary status in the history of our nation, Thomas Jefferson, the third president, also died on the 4th of July, 5 years earlier in 1826, and John Adams as well died on the exact same day in the same year as Thomas Jefferson, and then Monroe 5 years later on the exact same date. How about that? You can't make it up. And he was 73 years old at the time, and he was first buried in New York before being reinterred at Hollywood Cemetery in the Commonwealth of Virginia, I believe. The historical legacy of President Monroe include, here's a list of his major achievements, like he was the last president of the founding fathers generation, veteran of the American Revolution between the colonists and the British Redcoat Imperials, and he helped secure the Louisiana Purchase, and he led the nation through the era of good feelings, oversaw the acquisition of Florida from the Imperial Spanish Empire, approved the Missouri Compromise, issued the Monroe Doctrine, and strengthened American nationalism and westward expansion. Monroe is generally remembered as calm, practical, honest, deliberative, census-orientated. Rather than being a great orator or political theorist, he excelled as an administrator and diplomat who sought compromise and stability. Anyway, to round up today's video, what we can take away from all of this is President Monroe, from the perspective of modern historians, typically rank Monroe among the better early American presidents. His administration presided over a period of expanding national competence and territorial growth, while establishing principles of foreign policy that endured for well over a century. Although his presidency could not resolve the growing issue of slavery, his steady leadership helped guide the young republic through an important era of consolidation and expansion. That just about wraps up today's episode. Thank you very much for tuning in. Please subscribe to the channel and leave a comment down below. I'm very interested in what you have to say. Until next time, this has been yours truly, B9400 Ben Discusses History. Don't forget to subscribe